They told me my work belonged to the company. 15 years of designing the routing AI that made their millions, erased in a single restructuring memo. No apology, no credit, just silence and signatures. I didn't argue. I walked out, rebuilt what they stole, and made it stronger, under my own name. What happened next cost them over $200 million. If you've ever had your ideas stolen or your promotion postponed, you'll want to hear this. Stay with me. And if you believe loyalty should be earned, not exploited, subscribe and tell me your story in the comments. I sat in the glass conference room that afternoon, the skyline of Chicago blurred behind my reflection. Across from me, Richard Baines, the chief operating officer I'd reported to for 6 years, was smiling the same polite managerial smile he used when he was about to say something insulting, but legally safe. "Karen, I know how much this project means to you," he began, tapping the folder in front of him. "But the board has decided to reallocate your equity package under the new leadership structure. It's not personal, it's policy." I'd spent 12 years building the backbone of Altura Freight's automation platform, the routing intelligence system that kept our trucks on time across 9 states. They called it FleetMind. I wrote the first line of code, designed every logic sequence, and supervised the engineers who turned it into a multi-million-dollar product. I didn't flinch when he said reallocate. That word had the same weight as erase. They weren't just stripping equity, they were rewriting ownership. I listened quietly as he explained that my role would remain crucial, but my strategic stake no longer aligned with company direction. The same people who'd praised my innovation now called it infrastructure. The same executives who'd used my demos to close investor rounds were now folding my contribution into departmental output. I nodded once, not trusting my voice to hold steady. It wasn't shock, it was precision. The moment you see the truth of how corporate loyalty works, you stop feeling betrayed and start making calculations. Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice like we were partners in some difficult decision. "We're counting on you to keep things stable through the transition. You've always been reliable." Reliable, not visionary, not irreplaceable, just convenient. I'd been patient through 3 reorganizations, 2 CEOs, and a pandemic. I'd defended this company's system when rivals tried to copy it. Now I was a stability measure. I asked him one question. "Who'll manage FleetMind integration once I'm reassigned?" He blinked, then said, "We'll bring in external consultants to assist with continuity." That was my answer. They didn't just plan to erase my equity, they were cutting me out entirely. I gathered my notes, closed the folder, and said, "Thank you for the update." No protest, no defense. There's a special kind of silence that feels like strategy, and I carried it with me as I walked out of that room. Outside, the corridor smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee. Colleagues smiled politely, unaware that my 12-year loyalty had just been converted into a footnote in corporate minutes. I stopped by my desk, shut down my workstation, and slipped the small silver flash drive from my drawer, the same one I'd used for nightly backups of test models. It didn't contain company data, just my personal notes, architecture sketches, algorithm drafts, the kind of thinking that never belonged to Altura in the first place. I put it in my jacket pocket, straightened my ID badge on the lanyard, and took one last look at the operations floor. The screens flickered with real-time shipment dashboards, routes I'd optimized, delivery metrics I'd maintained for years. Every flashing number was proof that I'd made them faster, leaner, more profitable, and completely dependent. They thought removing me would save budget. It would save nothing. In 12 years, I had never missed a single deadline, never once left a client unanswered, never failed to deliver a system fix in under 48 hours. But loyalty means nothing to leadership that confuses innovation with compliance. When the elevator doors closed, I saw my reflection in the mirrored panel. Calm, unshaken, decisive. They had just created their biggest operational vulnerability. I didn't go back. I went in a different direction. Before Richard ever learned my name, I was the quiet engineer who made chaos predictable. Altura's systems were collapsing under outdated logistics software, and I rebuilt their operations model from scratch during a single winter quarter. The board praised my department for efficiency gains, but nobody asked who stayed past midnight rewriting optimization formulas that saved millions. That invisibility used to feel like pride, until I realized it was containment. They liked my precision, not my presence. Every time I proposed expanding FleetMind's algorithm to include adaptive routing, they stalled it with endless budget reviews. But when an outside consultant suggested the same framework, they called it visionary. That was the culture at Altura. Brilliance had to come with a different business card. I didn't forget the pattern. My shift began 2 years before the day they cut me out, when I met a mid-level operations analyst at a logistics conference in Denver. Her name was Lynn Tran. She'd just joined a smaller competitor called NorthAxis Freight Systems. Over coffee, she told me they were experimenting with a data-driven dispatch model, but couldn't get their predictive engine stable. I asked what variables they were using, and within minutes we were sketching solutions on a napkin. I could tell she actually understood the architecture, not just the presentation slides. She listened. I hadn't felt that in years. 2 weeks later, NorthAxis invited me to give a guest talk for their tech leads on network resilience. I went on my own time, unpaid, curious. Their CEO, Daniel Reyes, introduced himself afterward. He said, "We've been trying to build what Altura already has, but smarter." I smiled without answering. I wasn't ready to move then, but something shifted. I started noticing how Altura's innovation pipeline was slowing down. Layers of approvals, endless meetings about governance. Every new idea I proposed got absorbed into committee reports that went nowhere. Meanwhile, my engineers, Maya, Carlos, and Lynn, who'd later moved to NorthAxis, were growing restless. They were the kind of people who thrived on solving impossible problems, and I could see the frustration building. I told them to document everything, keep their prototypes safe. Not because I expected betrayal, but because experience had already taught me that companies forget authorship faster than they forget quarterly profits. My decision wasn't revenge, it was recognition. If I stayed, my ideas would keep feeding people who didn't even know how to read the code I wrote. The first seed of my exit wasn't planted by anger, it was planted by a conversation over coffee in Denver, by the sound of someone saying, "We'd love to know how you did that," instead of, "We'll get back to you after budget review." That's the difference between being valued and being used. I kept in touch with NorthAxis quietly, watching their growth from a distance. They weren't flashy, they were precise, ambitious, and small enough to listen. When Richard took my equity and called it policy, he thought he'd ended my leverage. He didn't know I'd already mapped the escape route 2 years earlier, built on quiet relationships, technical trust, and one unspoken rule. The people who actually build the system always hold the real power. I just needed the right moment to move, and now I had it. Within a week of walking out of Altura, my inbox was full of polite messages that all meant the same thing. "We're sorry to hear about the restructuring. What's next for you?" The only one I answered came from Daniel Reyes at NorthAxis. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered opportunity. "We've hit a ceiling with our current logistics model," he said over a video call. "We can't scale predictive accuracy without someone who understands operational math the way you do." That was his way of asking me to build again, this time without someone standing behind me to take credit. We agreed on a short-term consulting contract while I decided my next move. NorthAxis was a fraction of Altura's size, but they had what Altura lost years ago: hunger. They didn't have bureaucracy. They had whiteboards covered in equations, engineers still excited by the word impossible. On my first day inside, their Chicago office, I noticed their dispatch screen lagged 9 seconds behind live tracking. It was minor, but in freight systems, 9 seconds can cost thousands in fuel. I spent the evening tracing the bottleneck until I found a recursion loop in their code, a problem I'd solved 3 years earlier at Altura. I stayed up until dawn writing the fix. When I handed them the patch file the next morning, Daniel's jaw literally dropped as he watched their entire network sync to real time. "How did you," he started, but I just smiled. I used to build things like this for people who didn't listen. What began as consulting turned into collaboration. Within weeks, I was drawing blueprints for a new routing intelligence engine that could learn from driver performance and weather data simultaneously. I called it EchoPath. It wasn't a copy of FleetMind. It was its evolution, faster, modular, and free from Altura's proprietary constraints. But the real leverage came from something less technical. I knew Altura's weaknesses, not their secrets, but their dependencies, the soft spots hidden in overconfidence. Their database structure relied on outdated vendor APIs, which meant every optimization request had to pass through 2 translation layers. I built EchoPath without that drag, coding an independent data pipeline that could scale in real time. When we ran the first simulation, NorthAxis's delivery efficiency jumped 12% overnight. That's the kind of number investors notice. We kept it quiet. Daniel didn't announce my involvement publicly. Officially, I was a systems advisor. In reality, I was architecting the engine that would outpace the system I'd built before. My 3 closest engineers, Maya, Lynn, and Carlos, started reaching out in coded messages. "Are you consulting anywhere interesting?" Maya texted. I didn't recruit them, but they knew. People who share late-night code sessions and problem-solving marathons know each other's silence. They could sense I was rebuilding something. The hardest part wasn't writing new algorithms. It was unlearning corporate fear. At NorthAxis, I didn't need approval for every idea. I could test, break, and rebuild within hours. I kept hearing Richard's voice in my head saying, "It's not personal, it's policy." And every time I optimized another line of code, I realized how wrong he'd been. Innovation is always personal. It's every night you stay late because you care about something nobody else sees yet. It's the invisible pride behind every percentage point. And the ghost of Altura was still with me, not haunting, but guiding. Every inefficiency in their system had taught me what not to build. I didn't want revenge. I wanted proof that creation is the purest form of retaliation. 3 months later, NorthAxis's new engine was operational across 5 states. The moment we flipped the final switch, I watched the dashboards stabilize. Seamless routing, no lag, 0 manual overrides. Daniel turned to me and said, "You realize we just outperformed Altura's entire network, right?" I nodded, but I didn't smile. I knew it wasn't over. Altura still held the national distribution contract, the one worth $200 million annually. And in 6 weeks, they'd have to renew it, or lose it. I'd built EchoPath for that moment. The war they started with bureaucracy, I'd finish with performance. The contract was known inside the industry as the Titan Renewal, a $200 million bid that determined which freight network would handle national distribution for Greystone manufacturing. For 10 consecutive years, Altura had renewed it without competition. They thought it was guaranteed. NorthAxis was invited to the pitch only because the procurement board wanted to encourage competitive pricing. Daniel and I didn't bother arguing about odds. We prepared like we had something to prove. For 6 weeks, I barely slept. I rebuilt EchoPath's predictive engine to handle volatile weather variables, cross-referencing live radar data and real-time traffic sensors. It wasn't about presentation, it was about execution. I knew exactly how Altura would frame their pitch: cost efficiency, stability, brand trust. Those words had worked for a decade, but behind that reputation was a decaying core. Their system could no longer adapt on the fly without human intervention. I designed that original architecture myself, the adaptive layer they never implemented, the one Richard cut from budget alignment, was now the foundation of EchoPath. It was poetic symmetry disguised as innovation. The morning of the presentation, I wore the same charcoal blazer I'd worn during my final meeting at Altura. The difference was that this time, I walked into the Greystone boardroom with my name on the title slide. Karen Holt, Chief Systems Architect, NorthAxis Freight Systems. The Greystone executives were polite but skeptical. They'd heard of NorthAxis, but to them, we were an ambitious regional vendor, not a national player. I began the pitch not with claims, but with a live demo. We simulated a standard distribution route from Illinois to Texas, using Greystone's existing freight data. Altura's system projected a 40-hour delivery with a 2.7% error margin. EchoPath recalculated it in 21 seconds, optimizing for fuel, driver rest patterns, and weather detours. The new projection was 36 hours with a 0.4% margin of error. One of the Greystone directors leaned forward and asked, "How did you reduce variance without preloaded correction models?" I smiled slightly. Because EchoPath learns in real time. It doesn't wait for approval cycles to correct itself. The room went silent. They understood. They also understood something else. Altura's system had no such capability. Halfway through the presentation, I caught a glimpse of Richard across the table. Altura had sent him as their operations lead. His expression shifted from smug familiarity to dawning recognition. He knew this framework, knew the architecture, even if he didn't know my fingerprints were inside it. He leaned toward one of his analysts, whispering furiously while I finished the technical breakdown. I closed with a statement designed to sound neutral but land heavy. NorthAxis doesn't promise stability by avoiding change. We promise stability by engineering for it. That line became the headline of Greystone's internal report later that week. After our session, Daniel and I stepped out into the corridor, both pretending not to feel the pulse of adrenaline shaking through us. We didn't speak until we reached the parking garage. Then he exhaled. "They didn't expect that," he said. I shook my head. "No, but Richard will figure it out soon enough." The waiting was worse than the work. 5 days passed before Greystone announced their decision. Altura had lost the contract for the first time in 10 years. NorthAxis was awarded full management of national freight distribution, effective immediately. I was in Daniel's office when the call came through. He mouthed, "We got it," before the client even finished the sentence. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt was clarity. The board had chosen performance over legacy, truth over politics. I didn't need to see Altura's internal reaction to know the fallout had begun. That night, I checked the industry news feeds out of habit. An anonymous source from Altura confirmed internal software instability during their demo. I almost felt pity. Almost. By the end of the week, Greystone publicly credited NorthAxis's adaptive routing innovation as the deciding factor in their selection. The statement was short, factual, and irreversible. Richard called my personal number 2 days later. I let it ring. He texted instead. "Impressive work. Didn't realize you'd moved to NorthAxis. Maybe we should talk." I stared at the message for a long moment, then turned off my phone. There was nothing left to explain. The pitch wasn't revenge. It was correction. For years, they dismissed every warning, every idea that came without a title attached. They thought power lived in ownership. But power lives in understanding. That day, I'd simply reminded them who actually built their future. The morning after the contract announcement, my phone lit up like an alarm system. First came the congratulatory emails from industry contacts, then the press requests, and buried between them, Altura's name. The first message was from HR, phrased like a friendly outreach. "Karen, we'd love to have a conversation about future opportunities within the organization." Future opportunities. They couldn't even say the word return. I ignored it. 2 hours later, Richard tried again himself, his tone desperate and rehearsed. "We may have been hasty in how your transition was handled," he said in the voicemail, pretending the equity theft had been a scheduling error. "Let's discuss reinstating your leadership package. The board is open to revisions." I didn't delete the message. I saved it, like evidence in a trial that would never need a judge. That same afternoon, I met with Daniel and the NorthAxis team to plan our onboarding for the Greystone contract. The mood in the room was electric. Maya and Carlos had already been promoted to lead engineers, and Lynn had transferred officially from data analyst to systems integration head. They didn't follow me because I asked them to. They followed because they'd seen the difference between being silenced and being trusted. We built our team on that foundation. While we worked, updates trickled in from my former colleagues still inside Altura. Their systems were failing under the pressure of the lost contract. The consultants they'd hired didn't understand FleetMind's core logic. Integration loops froze. Delivery metrics tanked. Clients were demanding explanations that no one could give. Each message I read confirmed what I already knew. Altura hadn't just lost a contract, they'd lost the only people who could make their system function. Richard's third call came late that night. I was sitting in my apartment, lights low. Laptop open, reviewing a new performance dashboard that showed EchoPath handling live shipments without delay. His number appeared again, persistent and blinking. I let it ring out. He left another voicemail, this one stripped of charm. Karen, we need to talk. The board's authorizing immediate compensation review. Title, salary, everything on the table. We can fix this. He didn't realize it was never about fixing the position. It was about integrity, something you can't restore after you've publicly erased it. I listened to the message twice, not out of nostalgia, but to hear the exact moment when control left his voice. I forwarded it to my archive and closed my phone for the night. The silence that followed was satisfying in a way words couldn't express. For 12 years, I'd filled every silence at Altura with solutions, reassurances, and data. Now the silence belonged to them. In every failed shipment, every missed deadline, they could hear the echo of the voice they dismissed. I didn't return the calls, and I didn't answer the emails. I didn't need to. The lesson had already been delivered, through performance, not revenge. Within 2 weeks of the Greystone loss, Altura's polished corporate facade started to crack. Industry journals reported temporary routing disruptions across their Midwest operations, but I knew what that really meant. Fleet Mind had entered failure cascade. The engineers they'd rushed to replace us didn't understand how interdependent the modules were. Once one node faltered, the others followed. Every client whose one freight stalled called Greystone, who redirected them to us. EchoPath absorbed the overflow effortlessly. Watching it unfold from my new office at NorthAxis felt surreal. I didn't feel joy, only vindication. You can't steal intellect and expect it to keep working for you after its creator walks away. Richard must have realized that too, because his name started vanishing from news quotes. By the end of the month, Altura's board announced strategic leadership changes. Translation, he was out. Colleagues inside sent quiet messages, screenshots of resignation notices, project cancellations, internal memos that read like eulogies. Operations unsustainable without senior engineering leadership. Client retention below threshold. It was like watching the light drain from a city block. Every missed shipment, every complaint filed under systemic malfunction, traced back to a single decision: calling ownership a policy instead of a partnership. The collapse wasn't fast or loud, it was procedural, the way systems die when trust evaporates. Investors pulled out. Greystone's success with NorthAxis triggered a domino effect. 3 other manufacturers shifted contracts within weeks. At one point, someone forwarded me an industry thread titled "The Fall of a Giant." My name wasn't mentioned, but every insider knew who had written the original code. I archived the article with quiet satisfaction. Daniel called it poetic justice. I called it predictable. Companies forget that intellectual capital is alive. It breathes, adapts, and walks out the door when you insult it. I didn't sabotage Altura's operations. They did that themselves by removing the one thing their algorithms couldn't quantify: loyalty with a memory. By the end of the quarter, NorthAxis's metrics were breaking records, and Altura's public filings showed multi-million losses. Their silence was finally honest. It said everything words never could. A year later, I stood on a stage in San Francisco speaking at a logistics innovation summit. The topic was ethical architecture in automated freight systems. A quiet irony. Reporters kept asking about EchoPath's rise, about how NorthAxis had doubled its contracts and secured partnerships with 6 national manufacturers. I answered lessons from the story, 350 words. When I look back, I don't see revenge, I see correction. What happened at Altura wasn't unique. It happens in offices, startups, and boardrooms everywhere. Someone builds something extraordinary, and leadership convinces them it's part of the job. They disguise exploitation as opportunity, loyalty as patience, and theft as policy. The hardest lesson I learned is that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. Walking away doesn't make you the loser. It makes you the architect of your own future. In America, we're taught to keep pushing, to prove ourselves no matter how long it takes. But there's a line between persistence and self-erasure. The moment you realize your effort is being used to feed someone else's ego, you owe it to yourself to stop waiting for validation and start creating your own direction. I didn't ruin Altura. I just let gravity do its work once truth replaced illusion. They fell because they built their success on a lie, that innovation can be owned without respecting its creator. The deeper lesson is that sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, but sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. I never shouted, never argued, never tried to expose anyone. I simply removed my talent from the place that didn't value it, and the absence did all the talking. The same applies to anyone trapped in a cycle of being undervalued. You don't have to burn everything to the ground to make a point. Sometimes you just need to walk away and let the collapse speak for itself. How to get started today. Write down one skill or idea you've created that others depend on. Remind yourself of your worth. If your workplace keeps postponing your growth, set a private deadline for yourself, not for them. Update your professional profile quietly, even if you're not ready to leave. It's about options, not rebellion. Stop explaining your value to people committed to misunderstanding it. If you've ever had to walk away from a place that didn't see your worth, tell me your story in the comments. Share this with someone who needs the reminder. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding power where they never expected you to have it. Arid carefully, never mentioning Altura by name. The story wasn't about them anymore. It was about what happens when creators finally control their own blueprints. After the panel, a young engineer approached me, nervous but determined. "Ms. Holt," she said, "my company keeps postponing my promotion, saying it's about timing. How do you know when it's never going to happen?" I thought of Richard's voice, the folder with my revoked equity, the silence I carried to the elevator that day. "You know," I told her, "when their explanations start sounding like delays, not decisions." She nodded, and I saw the same mix of fear and recognition that once lived in me. The conference lights reflected off the award sitting beside me on the podium, Innovation Leadership, presented for EchoPath's national impact. I hadn't framed it yet. I kept it next to a single printed email, the one that said, "Your equity has been reallocated." Together, they told the whole story without a word. I didn't destroy Altura. I didn't need to. They did that themselves when they decided ownership mattered more than integrity. I simply walked away and built something they couldn't control. Revenge wasn't the goal. Clarity was. Success was just the byproduct of remembering who I was before they convinced me to be grateful for survival. In the end, I didn't burn their empire, I outgrew it, and the view from here was everything they once said wasn't possible.